Okay. I started to tell you something about the need for a liberal education, and I spoke about liberal education in its widest possible terms. I explained to you how everybody really needs to take responsibility for their own learning. Yes, the university will provide you with the particular skills that you need to do a particular job, but a liberal education is not about doing a particular job. What it's about is fitting you for a life which is fuller and more able to take part in the whole range of society. And also to enable you to, as Adam Smith put it, enable people to fully employ their leisure time, not their work time. Important difference. Skills and training, yes, they fit you for a job. But what about your appreciation of the world around you, your appreciation of art and literature and music, the personal growth that you might experience in terms of who you are as a person? Liberal education looks to that area and is concerned with you and your personal growth and your personal expansion into the world, so that you become an interactive and fully participating person with a wide range of knowledge which you can employ at any time for almost any purpose. So I've spoken about liberal education in its general form. I want to talk now about a specific application of that. What does that actually look like in reality? What does it mean that you learn, and how does that work? Well, I've got a paper here for you to read. It's called The Lost Tools of Learning, and it's by, surprisingly, Dorothy L Sayers. I don't know if you can see that. Lost Tools of Learning by Dorothy L Sayers, first published way back in 1948, so way before any of us, even me, was even born. And in terms of the lost tools, what Dorothy L Sayers, and by the way, Dorothy L Sayers was extremely well-known authoress who wrote mostly detective fiction, and had a famous character you may or may not have heard of, Lord Peter Wimsey, often played in by Ian Carmichael and other people on TV and in films. But that's beside the point, really. She's a very learned person, and she's speaking as a lay person too, because most of the educational establishment does not take this view. Okay, this is a minority view. The most of the educational establishment takes a modern, progressive, left view of how education should be done. This is quite different, and this is a harking back to a time when education was done in a different kind of way. And I'm going to upload this paper for you to read at your own leisure. It's a very, very simple paper to read. It's not a technical paper, but it sets out some ideas which you will probably never have come across before. In fact, most educationalists these days will never have come across them before. Because it takes us back to a time when education was, maybe many hundreds of years ago, done in a completely different way. So, what I'll do now in the remaining 5 or 10 minutes of this video is just to tell you briefly what this paper is about. And then I'll upload it for you to read for yourself. First of all, she talks very generally about how, although she's not an expert in the field, she has something to say. And I think she makes that reasonably well. And the question she wants to ask and to look at is, are we really teaching the right things as a society, as an educational establishment? Are we really teaching the right things in the right way? And she thinks, no, we're not. And we're not doing that as well as we need to. It says, if we are to produce a society of educated people fitted to preserve their intellectual freedom amid the complex pressures of our modern society — remember, modern society then was 1948 — we must turn back the wheel of progress some 400 or 500 years, to the point at which education begins to lose sight of its true object, which was towards the end of the Middle Ages, she says. Now, before you dismiss me with an appropriate phrase of reaction, romantic, medievalist, whatever, I ask you to consider a couple of things. First of all, she says that students went to university in, say, Tudor times, Middle-Age times, after Middle-Age times, probably at the age of 14. And they progressed far more rapidly in subjects than people do these days. You might ask yourself, why is that? Maybe something to do with their education and how they were educated. And these days, she also points out the students are, she says, much less able to distinguish fact from opinion, and that we often are more easily taken in, often by propaganda and by media. Students, she says, can't debate properly, they can't define their terms properly, they can't write properly, they can't use sources properly, they can't link subjects properly, they can't expound properly, all of which is absolutely true. And I sit here as a person who sees many students who leave state schools who are woefully unprepared to take part in university life, can't even string a sentence together in some cases, certainly can't put an argument together. And that's not your fault, it's not the school's fault either, it's often government policy's fault in the way in which we've moved. So that's my personal view of the matter. It's probably an outsider's view, but it's certainly the same view that Dorothy L Sayers has here. And she says there's lots of errors of thinking, and she gives some examples of errors of thinking, which I won't go into, but you can read that for yourself. So she says that we have knowledge, often skillful knowledge, often a detailed knowledge, maybe of computing and of the areas that you're looking at, but what we don't have are the tools for correctly handling knowledge. And the reason for that is that we don't teach the important elements before knowledge first. And what she says is quite interesting. She says, speaking as an individual, I do have some experience of my own life and learning. And when I look back at my life, she says, it falls into three natural stages. First of all, there's what she calls the parrot stage, where, you know, at a young age, you love to learn lists of things, and you might learn the names of all the birds in the garden, or you might all the flags in the world, and all that kind of thing. Like you have an amazing facility for memory, and that's a natural stage in young child's development. After that, she says, there's the pert stage. The pert is where you're a bit presumptuous, and you start questioning things. You question everything. You like to catch people out. You like to pick up on your particularly older people and tell them that they've got this wrong and they've got that wrong. I remember my young nephew, who's actually 14, delights to get people right. When someone said, "Oh, the Berlin Wall fell in '89," he said, "No, wait a minute, they fell in. There were two areas. It was decommissioned 3 years before it was that." And for a 14-year-old, you know, you might say it's precocious, but nevertheless, you have that age of disputation, and that's what she called the pert age. And then after that, after you've got tired of being disputatious, then comes the poetic age, where you begin to expand yourself, expand your imagination and your ability to move on and to create things for yourself. So she said those three ages that natural children often go through are were echoed by the original way in which people were taught back at the end of the Middle Ages and just after that. We had two educational phases. First of all, there was what was called the trivium, followed by the quadrivium. Now, the trivium is essentially a three-part element which was about how to learn. That was taught originally. And then after that, there was the quadrivium, which is about subject areas, particular subjects. And in those days, there were things like theology and astronomy and all those kind of things. But the trivium is the lost tool of learning, because although we teach subjects these days, we don't teach in the same way, the kind of learning tools that you need before you can even start to tackle the subjects. So what we've lost here, she says, is this trivium, which corresponds very naturally to the 3 ages that human beings naturally fall through if they're curious and questioning. So she says the trivium is divided up into 3 parts. There is the grammar part, the dialectic part, and the rhetoric part. The grammar part is about learning the structure of a language, because if you're going to learn anything, you have to learn it through the medium of a language, and therefore learning the structure of the language becomes a very, very important element in mastering the tools. I've already spoken about this in terms of vocabulary, which is only a small part of the language. But learning a language, of course, in those medieval days, that was about learning Latin. But it's not so much the Latin itself which was the important thing, but it's actually the structure of a language. And you learn the structure, not only how to, it's not about ordering a meal in a foreign language, it's about learning how structured thought is put together. Tenses, moods, the way in which they correspond to elements in the world, and how you can put things together. Once you've got a structure of a language, learning that, the grammar part, you then move on to the dialectic part, which is how to use that language to generate good arguments. So once you've widened your vocabulary, widened your understanding of how the technical tools work, then you can start to use it to generate good arguments, to construct arguments. That's the dialectic part. And then thirdly, there was the rhetoric part, which is how to express yourself eloquently and persuasively. And each person would go through those stages in we don't use those things today, but we should, according to Dorothy L Sayers. And just zipping through, she says, I don't want to do too much here, but she says let's take each part in turn to give you an idea of how this works out in practice. So in the parrot stage, or the grammar stage, then what you need to do is you need to learn verbs by heart, learn the structure of a language, so that when a child can, in her case she's talking about Latin, but you should be able to chant amo amasa mat, which is the kind of verbal structure of endings in Latin, in the same way that a child would chant eeny meeny miny mo, because at that time in your life, quite early on, you have the most amazing facility for memorizing things. And I think the point is that you should learn English in a memorizing kind of way. So you memorize verse and prose, which can be learned by heart. You store them into your memory so that you'll have them forever, till the end of your life. You learn about stories, you learn about myths, you learn about legends, you learn about all kinds of classic elements of English. Recitation aloud should be practiced in this particular kind of school, and you can do it individually or in chorus, so that you drill students with that knowledge and embed that knowledge into them, so they have a wide range of the understanding of the background. History should be done in the same kind of way, this first early stage, where dates are memorized, events are memorized, anecdotes, personalities, people, stories are all learnt off by heart. Geography is the same thing. At this early stage, where the memory is fantastic and you can memorize all kinds of things, then you should present geography in historical, in its factual aspect, with maps, natural features, places, customs, flora and fauna, all learned by heart. Science, you should learn to identify specimens. You can identify animals, you give them names, so all the names of birds, classification systems, memorize everything. Get the children to memorize the whole lot by heart, so that what you're doing is you're storing up tools within them at a time when their facilities are available to them, to enable them to use that later on. I'll give you one more example here. Mathematics, for example. Mathematics is begins with a multiplication table. If you don't learn it now at this particular age, you will never learn it. So you have to drill your younger people with, 2 twos are 4, 3 twos are 6, 4 twos are 8. I learned that when I was about 6 or 7. Still have it now, 50 years later on. And it's amazing that if you do learn things at that stage, you will have them forever. If you don't learn them then you won't. So it's all part of your learning. So you memorize all these things for the next stage. And the next stage starts, you might say, when does the next stage start? It starts when you are starting to enter into the disputatious stage, when you become into that pert stage. Oh, by the way, he also says you should learn something about the Bible and theology, and learn the stories of the Bible from creation right the way through, if only because they are the foundation pillars of Western thinking and thought, and have been so for 2,000 years, and you should know something about them. They're the foundation of Shakespeare and other things too, which are their own things. And some moral elements too. She talks about the 10 Commandments. You should learn those things off by heart, so that they become embedded in a person's understanding of the world in which they have been set at this time. This is where we are. And when does the next stage begin? Well, it's difficult to say, she says, because precisely we should pass from the first to second stage of the trivium. Generally speaking, the answer is as soon as the pupil shows themselves to be pert and with interminable arguments and answering back. Then you move on to the section of dialectic, which is about learning to reason and using the syllogism particularly as the cornerstone of that. If all A is B, that can be cast into syllogistic form, looking at logic, looking at paradoxes, looking at all the elements. And so, and you can apply that to the various areas too. So language, you'll move on to looking at syntax and analysis. In English, you look at starting to writing things and to debates, presenting arguments, presenting your case. In mathematics, you'll move on to the more abstract terms, things of algebra and geometry. In history, you won't just look at the dates and events, but you look at, was the action of this person justified? Was it not justified? What is the outcome of this? In theology, you'll discuss conduct and morals, and you'll debate backwards and forwards the rights and wrongs of things. You'll seek to find out the weakest argument, and you'll expose those arguments. And you can use newspapers at this point to good effect, so that all the legal decisions which are made, or all the cases which come up, are they right? Are they wrong? What is the rightness or wrongness of those kind of things? At this point too, you can do précis writing, where you present your argument powerfully and strongly in an essay form, and then you have to précis it, which means reduce it down by 25% or 50%, and you learn to economize your thoughts and make yourselves more elegant. And then you have to move on to the next stage. Towards the close of this stage, pupils probably begin to discover for themselves that their knowledge and their experience are actually insufficient, and that their trained intelligence needs a great deal more material to chew upon. The imagination, which is dormant during the pert age, will reawaken and will prompt them to suspect the limitations of logic and reason. And that means they're passing into the poetic age, which is the third of the 3 ages. Remember, they said the parrot age, the pert age, and the poetic age, the third stage. And this is where we start to look at rhetoric. And it's difficult to map out rhetoric, she says, because you need to give person the freedom to choose the topics and the subject which they want. Any child which shows a disposition to specialise should be given its head, for when the use of tools has been well and truly learned, it's available for any study whatsoever. So if you've learned the 3 elements of grammar, dialectic and rhetoric, you can use that in any area you want. And you have the tools for mastering, therefore, any subject. Science will become the mistress subject at this point, because science is the one which checks that everything is correct and done properly. And at the end, Well, the end in the trivium was always done by a final thesis where a student had to stand up and present a public defense of an argument or a case of some form as a kind of leaving examination, and the entire school would be able to attack that, and they would have to defend it publicly. And that is the trivium, and that is suitable, she says, for lifelong learning. That's the approach to lifelong learning. That gives you an idea of the kind of layout of the paper here. I do strongly recommend that you have a look at it, have a read through it. It's very easy to read. It's about, it says 20 pages long, but they're very easily written, and it gives you a good idea of the kind of education which is not available today. And if it's not available today, and if it's a good thing to have, and it certainly was good for those people who were scholars in that day and age. And by the way, I've read some of the books that people have wrote 400, 500, 600 years ago. In fact, on my shelves behind me, you can probably see many of the books there are very old. Some of them go back to 1600s, some to the 1500s. And I have to tell you that the writing, you might think, people who wrote those must have been quite simplistic, they didn't know very much. The arguments which they present, and the way in which they dispute, and the way in which they argue and reason, is as complicated, if not more complicated, and more soundly based than anything which you read today. Reading the works of William Perkins, or you only have to read Shakespeare to understand how complex the thought processes were of people there. And I put that down to the same thing that Dorothy L Sayers puts it down to, which is a good education. You can't write like that and have such profound thoughts and understandings without a good education. And in many cases that education is surpasses the education which is available today in universities, in my view. So if you wish to make up the difference or the gap, I'm afraid it's mostly down to you. And if you want a good education, well, you can, because you're now in a position whereby all of the material you'd ever need is available to you at the click of a button. You can learn anything you want. All it requires is motivation, curiosity, and a desire for personal improvement. And I'm sure that that, if only for enlightened self-interest, is a thing which we should all possess.